Christy would tell me, she's like, you're angry. And I'm like, I'm not angry. And she's like, no, you're really angry. I'm like, no, I'm not angry.
No, I am.
Like, I'm angry because you're telling me that I'm angry, you know? And I would realize, like, you know, it's like 3 to 5 business days to process my feelings.
One of the things I wanted to talk to you about is I saw a little clip from a video that you did actually for staff retreat.
Yes.
You were teaching on something, and it is the most vulnerable I've ever seen you. It was powerful. I got a little bit emotional watching it, to be honest. Can you tell me a little bit about your own journey with vulnerability?
Yes. Yeah. So I have probably for the last 5 years or so, prior to COVID, I started doing some counseling.
Do you counseling or going?
Going to counseling,
okay.
Attending counseling. And I went through a couple counselors and just kind of did not really feel like they were a good match. Mm-hmm. And then COVID hit, and so I kind of pulled back from that. But I think since then, I've plugged in with a counselor and really started kind of attaching myself to my own story. And I think what I've realized is for probably the first 40 years of my life, my whole strategy was to suppress my emotion and keep moving forward. Like, you don't have to feel it. You don't have to engage with it.
Not the best strategy.
I mean, you'll end up in therapy.
Yeah.
And so, and I think kind of retroactively, I just think I was detached from my body physically, emotionally. Mm-hmm. I stress eat. Sometimes don't even realize that I've eaten an entire bag of candy if I'm stressful. Or,
I heard of something about this, Rick, that you night eat too.
I do. When I'm very stressed, I like night eat. And so I have woken up and like Christy will be like, why did you eat all those Starburst last night? I'm like, what are you talking about? And there'll be like 50 Starburst wrappers like strewn around the bed and on the floor. And so
I learned that because we went to a conference and the guys were saying how in the morning there was this one muffin with a little bite eaten out, and they were all like, who ate a muffin? And you finally were like, guys, it could have been me.
So like I have no recollection, but it could have been me.
I did not even know that was a thing.
So,
but can you tell me about, because you said in the video that I watched about sending a text to Mike and how it changed your life.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, I was taking some time away, and I feel like I'm a person who is always striving to improve. So I want to know, how can I do better? How can I be better? And so I had asked Mike, hey, I'm going to take some time away. I'm really praying about the future of the church, just my own development. And so I asked him to tell me what areas he felt like I needed to improve in. And I was expecting him to say, get better at having hard conversations, or, improve your preaching, or, get a better meeting strategy, or something along those lines. And I think instead it was a very emotional text message. In fact, he came back afterwards like, if that was too much, I'm sorry. It was very long and it was very thoughtful. And I think there's a sense in which Pastor Mike has played the role of a spiritual father for me. And so I think this was one of those moments where he stepped in, and instead of just giving me a list of things to do, he said to me, Rick, I've known you for years now, and you're one of the easiest people to be around and one of the hardest people to know. And so I began to think about that. He said, I had another conversation kind of right after that where I was meeting with some guys that I talk to regularly, and they were like, Rick, you're just always so even-tempered and even keel, and like, you just don't get, like, your emotions are just kind of like, you're always the stable person. And that's so good. And I'm like, actually, I don't know that it is good.
Wow.
Like, I think sometimes it's because I don't want to tell people what's really going on. And so I want to always present as if I have it together, sometimes because I don't know what's going on. And then other times I think because I just don't want anyone to see that I'm angry or I'm frustrated or I'm depressed. And so I'm like, if I just present evenly, I'm easy to be around. And I think through counseling, kind of bringing this back to that, I think through counseling I've realized it's easy for me to attune to other people and to kind of meet them where they're at.
You're very good at that.
And to be able to be whatever that person needs for me to be. And at the same time, the way that I do that is I am not attuned with myself. And so
how is that? Like, what do you mean? You mean you're so detached from you that you can feel everyone and maybe not be aware what you feel?
Yes. Like, I think I can walk into a room and kind of quickly surmise, hey, this person needs this from me and this person needs this from me, and not really ever have thought about, how do I feel in this moment? Like, what's actually going on with my own person?
You know what? I heard Louis Theroux, who's like a British interviewer, make this statement recently where he said the same thing that made me brilliant at work made me terrible in life. And I just thought of that hearing you say that. It's like, because I have worked under you as an executive pastor, and the thing everybody loves about you is you're approachable. You can take anything to Rick, and some days it's just like just piles of garbage on, like, because you're never going to be mad. You're going to be even keel. You'll take it in, and you somehow can coach us and still make us feel better. You're not capitulating to us,
right?
But it's like, but you just take all the junk, and I've always seen that as your superpower, that you can do that. But it might be partly what's made you brilliant.
Yes.
There has made it hard in your personal life, you'd say, or just as a human? Maybe
as a human. I'm laughing because I remember a staff member saying, Rick, you're like the garbage compactor of grace. Like, we just bring everything to you and dump out the trash can, and you sort through it, and you take what you want, and we leave with what we want, and then the rest is there, and I don't ever know what happens to it, but it just goes away.
And you're like, that is this 40 pounds.
I do think there's a sense in which, it's a gift. I think even for my family and for my kids,
yes.
I think,
definitely.
But I think what I've learned is, there's different attachment styles too. And I think my attachment style is not reactive, and so my attachment style is more avoidant. And so, so there's a sense in which I can avoid things sometimes for forever, and it won't dysregulate me. Like, it's there, and if you ask me about it, I can bring it back out. But I have this very strong ability to kind of detach from that, and then, just move forward and pretend like it's not there, pretend like it doesn't exist, and it's not healthy, So what it does is it comes out sideways other times, So it comes out by me eating Starburst in the middle of the night, or and I think early in marriage, even Christy would tell me, she's like, "You're angry," and I'm like, "I'm not angry," and she's like, "No, you're really angry." I'm like, "No, I'm not angry."
No, I am.
No, I'm angry because you're telling me that I'm angry, And I would realize, it's like 3 to 5 business days to process my feelings. And I would be like, 5 days, like, I was really upset. And she's like, yeah, I'm aware, So I do think it has created a sense where, like, the work that I'm doing in counseling is how do I be more attuned to how I'm feeling in the moment. And it still is not easy for me to respond to things in the moment sometimes. Like, if I have a hard conversation with Christy, she can very quickly be like, this is how I feel. This is how I think you feel. This is what I think the problem is.
She is a
Here's
counselor,
what I think we move forward. She is a counselor, right? And she's very good at it.
Yes.
And there's times where I'm like, okay, and she's like, all right, now what? And I'm like, I'm going to need some time to process that and think about it. Mm-hmm. And I think in the past, I was good at saying that and then not ever coming back to it. And so I think even just personally, we're able to be like, hey, let's we're going to talk about this in 2 days, or I'm going to sit down and kind of map out all my feelings and thoughts in writing. I'll send you an email and then we can talk about it, or, so I do think there's some strategies we've had to use, or I've had to use, to kind of just be able to engage with those things.
Was there a time ever when you found yourself unable to, like, compartmentalize it away, and some of the things that kind of led you to say, okay, I need help? Maybe Mike's text, but what was really the impetus where you were going, I can't keep avoiding this?
Yeah, I think Mike's text, I heard a talk, I don't even remember who the talk was from, where he was just talking like, hey, if you can't deal with your own emotions, you can't really ever effectively deal with anyone else's. And I remember there was a time with Trey, who is my second child, right? And Trey is a verbal processor, and Trey is very direct with his communication, and Trey is a kid that he will quickly tell you what he's feeling. He's quick to make judgment, and sometimes that frustrates me. And so there was a time where we were in the car, and he was just talking, and he was doing nothing wrong, but it was so dysregulating to me. And on the way home, I called Christy, and I was like, I'm like, Trey is just like dumping all this stuff. And she goes, that's a you problem and not a him problem. And I was like, and I really started thinking about it. And I realized in that moment, I said, I have spent 40 years of my life trying not to process and deal with my emotions. And Trey wants me to process and deal with his emotions 4 seconds later. And so I'm like, this is a deficit to him. It's not a superpower for him, for me to be like, I don't have space for your emotions, so I can hear them. But he was wanting to engage with them and talk about them and process them. I'm like, that just feels like too much. And so I think there was a sense in which I wanted to be better for the people around me. Mm-hmm. And I realized it was going to mean I had to be better for myself. Like, it's not a superpower to not ever have feelings.
That's really good, because honestly, in that story, I relate a lot more to you than I do. I'm sitting there going, "Whoa, wow, really?" Like, I have kids that dump a lot.
Right.
I have a lot of daughters, and it's like, at times, I've never thought of it that way, that that's a me problem, not because Clint and I were like, golly, these kids just talk so much.
Yes.
Like they and nobody wants to be the human garbage collector all the time. But if I'm really breaking down, it could be a me problem. That's interesting. You are one of the most strategic thinkers I know. Always a lifelong learner, even in this. Like I do admire that much as you expected Mike's answer to be professional, which is what I would have expected too.
Yeah.
He throws you a curveball and you did lean into it and said, okay, I want to learn in all areas of my life. Something that you've talked a lot about, so like you're kind of developed and pitched to the staff, is this idea of the 5-year rule or the 5-year principle.
Right. Yeah.
Break that down for me a little bit.
Yeah, I think as I was processing, I was actually getting ready for a staff retreat talk, and I was thinking through, that we are always evolving as people, and I think if we're not intentional with that, we're evolving and we're not taking control over who we're becoming. So, and I think there's a sense in which we can think about our evolution as something that happens to us instead of our evolution being something that we actually can impact and we can actually have ownership of. And so in that, I just started thinking through the fact that, every 5 years of your life, it's almost like you're a totally different person. And I think it's very obvious when you're a kid to think about that. Like if you have a 1-month-old versus a 5-year-old, like totally different skill sets, like they're starting to write their name, they're starting to know their alphabet, the growth curve is just so steep. And then from 5 to 10, you kind of have a totally different kid again. And then from 10 to 15, a totally different kid, and 15 to 20. And so I think it's very easy to kind of see in our children. But then I started just thinking about my own personal life. And even, I've been at a church for 10 years. And I think it was 5 years in that I thought, okay, this is not just something that I've inherited. I'm now part of the problems. I'm now part of the solutions. Like I've been shaping this place for 5 years. And so, but me as a student pastor 5 years in was very different than me as a student pastor at the beginning. And I think, there's a lot of times where in the church world, at least, there's a lot of turnover in staff, or there can be. Grace has been very unique in that we have not had that. But in my tenure at my last church, I was there for almost 10 years, and every other church in town had 4 to 5 student pastors in that time. And I think there's a sense in which you could get through that and say, I have 10 years experience, but I'm like, no, you have 2 years experience 5 times. And so I think as we're staying in something, for, whether that's parenting, whether that's marriage, whether that's, not just a career, but even a career at a specific place, every 5 years, it's almost like the environment you're in demands something new of you and something different from you. And so you're either going to grow and meet that demand, or you're going to get passed over. And so it's like, how do I own that? How do I become a part of that? And
so it's funny because recently I was talking to someone who made the comment that he's similar to what you're saying. He's a totally different person now than he was in his 30s. Right. He was like, that version of me is like gone. Yeah. And he was saying it hopefully, like you were saying it. And at the time, for some reason, my visceral reaction was sadness. Like when he said it, I just thought, there almost feels to me to be like some sort of a loss there. Right. And I was processing, I don't know, Jonah Hill? He's an actor, but there was a season where on Netflix he had his therapist on it. It's called Stutz, this show. And it's literally, you probably do know Jonah Hill, War Dogs, or yes. I'm trying to think of his movies.
I don't know actors or musicians by name, just by, oh yeah, I knew who that person is.
You would totally, he's a comedian. He's a really, really funny comedian. And basically hit all the things he wanted in life, right? Fame, women, money, all that. Right. But he has this therapist who means a lot to him. And in one episode, they talk about the shadow person. And he has a picture, a carved, like, cut out cardboard picture of himself at his heaviest weight. And something he's like harped on in Hollywood for often is like his weight fluctuates. And he has like so disassociated from this old version of him that he's like buried it. And I think it's like there's what is like I'm becoming the best version of me, and what is I'm just burying the past versions. Right. And like he ended up in it by burying it, it sort of ironically had the loudest voice in his life because he's always suppressing it. Right. And the therapist had him basically give voice to that guy. And the guy, when he really got in tune with it, was like, man, I'm mad at you. You've silenced me. You've cut me out of your life. And he went through this process of basically saying, like, I'm sorry. I'm going to accept you as a part of my story. Right. And I've talked to Christian girls who've told me, like, one recently was like, I have this vision of me when I was younger. and she's like this booty short wearing, shaking my, like
Right.
whore, and I
Yeah.
hate her. And she's like, and the hope I find is that I'm a new creation in Christ. The old is gone, the new. And I told her, I think you're missing a component of healing, which is to go back to that girl and love her
Right.
and see that she has insecurity and brokenness and she wanted love, instead of just she's dead and I hate her.
Yes.
And there's
Yeah.
something of this like dead next
Yeah.
person, like reinventing ourselves.
Yes. Yeah.
Everyone says it like it's good, and there's
Right.
a part of me that's like, where's that line?
Yeah, I think, Jeanne, for me, as I've thought about this, like, I think it hits, and I think what you're hitting on is like a beautiful part of the story. Like, so I think about, there's a piece of us that is not changing, right? Like, and I think this is the Imago Dei. This is like the part of God in us that is unchanging. And so I can go back to people I knew in high school, and I'm a totally different person, and yet I'm not. Like, there's still parts
There's
of my
something that is
personality.
there,
There's
yeah.
parts that I am who I am, right? And yet there's something very hopeful to me about the fact that I'm not stuck in these places. And I think the hopeful thing about God is he's not ever changing. Like, he is going, like, I mean, his most intimate name, I am who I am. Like, I always will be who I always have been. And I think, man, if I always had to be the worst version of myself, like the person, like if I couldn't evolve emotionally, if I couldn't evolve spiritually, if I couldn't evolve, financially, if I couldn't evolve relationally, like, who I would be would not be a good person. And so to me, like, there's this hope in both sides of that. Like, God has put this personality in me, but I'm not stuck in the worst parts of that. Like, it can always be improving. It can always be growing, but there's still something that is still Rick, and it doesn't matter if it's my aunt that I've not seen since I was 6 years old, or, somebody I run into from high school, like, they still recognize me.
I love that. That when you think about that, like the unchanging nature of God, how does it influence the way you think of the next 5 years of your life?
Yeah, I mean, it gives me great hope to think like I can pursue something, and I can pursue looking and being like someone who is perfection, and so he's perfect, so we can pursue him. And I think that gives me hope because I'm called to be like him. And so there's this sense in which the thing that I'm pursuing is unchanging. And that's why I have to pursue it, because I am changing all the time, and I can go backwards, And so, and I think even like this girl, who says that part of me is dead, right? I think you're right. And like the part of counseling that we want to do is like, we want to almost give voice to those people. We want to, those versions of us.
Yeah.
We want to recognize like there's a reason that girl existed. Like she was not just this, piece of a puzzle. Like she has a story prior to that moment as well. And I think even Disney hits on this. Like when we have these moments where you have Maleficent, who's the villain,
Yes.
but like let's give voice
Such
to
a good
Maleficent,
movie.
right? Like let's give voice to how Maleficent was created and how she
Ooh, that
became
just
this
gave me
thing.
chills.
It's like there's a reason the villain becomes the villain. And there's parts of us that are villain. And so there's reasons for that. And so I think that is, to me, some of the work in counseling is like, like I am forever trying to avoid shame. Enneagram 3,
Same.
we are in the shame triad, right? And so 3 with a 4 wing. So there's just lots of shame. And I remember I was having this conversation with my counselor, and I was like, I feel so foolish that I'm 40-something years old and I'm thinking about these parts of myself for
I
the
have
very
said the
first time,
exact same
right?
thing, yes.
And I'm like, I feel so foolish. And he was like, Rick, why would you think that you're foolish? Like what? And so he was having me think through, like, think about all that you've been able to accomplish by not engaging with that part of your story yet. Like, and so he was trying to like give voice for like, there's reasons, like, let's think through the reasons. Let's think through like what you've gained by not engaging with that part of your story. And so he kind of talked me through this whole thing. And so he really got me to believe it was not foolish. And the very next thought I had was, yes, but it's weak. And I'm like, you're right. It wasn't foolish. It was weak, and he's like, Rick, and he said, you need to understand, like, you could keep peeling the onion back, and around every corner, like, there is shame waiting to judge you and waiting to, and so you're going to have to keep doing this work of owning those parts of your story, giving grace to those parts of your story, of giving voice to those parts of your story, but also understanding like they didn't happen in isolation. Like there's reasons that got you to that moment, and there's reasons that you're here now. And so, but I think there's more power in integrating those parts of your story than there is in isolating and trying to cut those parts of your story out. Like you can be like, I wish they hadn't happened, but they did. And they actually have shaped who you are right now. And you would not be the person you are. I would not be the person I am without those parts of my story that I don't want anyone to know.
One of my favorite things you said in the video I saw was that you always thought people would connect with you over your success or want to be close to you over your success, and you found that they might respect you for your success, but they'll connect with you for your weakness.
Yeah.
And even in watching it, it's part of why I got choked up, because I connected with you. And that's what I really want to hear, is some wise leader pull back the curtain and say, this is hard for me to be vulnerable, you know. I'll tell you an analogy that I haven't told many people this, but I'm turning 40 this year. And I think I'm thinking about the chapters of your life.
Right.
I feel like I'm getting to a place where a lot of the decisions and ideals I had earlier, I'm questioning, because I'm seeing them played out, and I'm looking at my kids, especially in parenting, and going like, have I gotten a lot wrong? And it almost feels like an undoing. And I was telling God, like, is this an identity crisis? Like, is it a midlife crisis? Like, am I having a total crisis? And this analogy popped in my mind that I think maybe the Lord gave me, but I really thought if I was a Tupperware cabinet, if that was my life, because my Tupperware cabinet is a big fat mess, I feel like in my 20s, I was filling it with all like the perfect like Pyrex dishes. It was like really like ideals. This is how marriage looks. This is what good Christians do. This is blah, blah, blah. Yes, and everything had a place. And then as life moved faster in my 30s, I just out of necessity was just throwing, you know, the ham Tupperware that you're not supposed to read, like the lids everywhere. Right. I just throw it all in until it was full, and life felt full and crazy. And I wasn't like idealism. I was like survivalism, like just make it through the day. And somewhere in my 40s, I feel like the Lord said, Jeanne, it's not all gone. Because I literally said, do I know nothing? And I feel like he said, it's time to sort the cabinet. So it's all on the kitchen floor. And we're going to take the lids that don't have bottoms and throw them. And those like nasty beliefs.
Right.
And we'll throw those out. But it is still there. Like the good stuff is still there. I'm just going to sort it and put it back inside. And it gave me a lot of hope that I think sometimes in growing, you go backwards.
Right.
It feels very backwards. Like, how can I know less now than I did when I was 20? But I think that's part of it.
Yes, I think that's wisdom, right? I think in your 20s, you're so confident that you have all the answers, right?
Yes.
And I think there's like some gift in that, because you go out and you do crazy things. Like, I have it all figured out. And I think kind of in your 40s, you're starting to be like, it's not as black and white as I think the world is. Right? Like there's so much gray.
Yes.
And I think in your 20s, life can be very black and white. You know, I think before I had kids, I was a wonderful parent, right?
The best parent in the world.
Like,
okay, can I just...
What were you doing over there? Why is that person acting like that? My kids will sleep. You know, no, they won't. You know?
Let me tell you, I talked to Pastor Mike the other day, and he said, I asked him a question about toddler tantrums. He said he's never had one tantrum in his whole life. I was almost like, get out of my student.
His kids haven't, or he hasn't?
His kids have not had tantrums.
Oh, well.
Is that not?
He can come to my house. So,
that's what I said. And then we asked the producer, and he was like, yeah, my kids don't either. I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, no. But about parenting, humbling you. What have you learned through that journey of like watching your kids and grow and develop? And
yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, your kids grow and develop and change and all these things, and we see that. I think for me, like parenting has changed me so much. You know? And so I have 3 kids. There's 8 years between my oldest and youngest. And I think even this concept of like the fact that we are evolving and really changing every 5 years, my oldest kid has a totally different parent than my youngest kid had.
Yes.
You know, they're raised by the same people, but I'm a totally different person at this point. And so I think for me, there's been these moments that I've had to confront my own problems, you know, and I always joke, my wife is a therapist, you know, she's an Enneagram 1, I'm a pastor, Enneagram 3. And so I'm like, it's kind of crazy at our house because, you know, Enneagram 3 is like, you can do more. And Enneagram 1 is like, you can do better, you know? So I'm like, if we're not careful, the refrain of our house is, you can do more and you can do better, you know? And like one of my kids, they're much more laid back. They're much more, you know, just kind of like, if I can get a B and do most of my work, why would I do extra credit? Like I got a B. And I'm like,
definitely have most of my kids.
Yes, you know, and I'm like, if I have 100 and I can do an extra credit project and get 110, why would I not?
1,000%.
So, like,
me
why
too.
would you not? And so I think for me, I've had to realize like the way I do things doesn't mean that the way my kids have to do things. I have to give grace to them. None of my kids are super laid back. I mean, they're all driven in their own way, and they're all, they've all had tantrums. We'll just say that. So, but I was sitting with my oldest the other day, and one of my younger kids was just having a rough day, and they were, we won't say having a tantrum, but they were not happy. And there was all of these reasons that I could see as to why. But as a result, they were mean to my oldest. And so I was sitting with her on the couch then, everybody else was in bed, and she's like, why do they treat me that way? Like, why are they so mean to me? Like, I'm always kind. I'm like, you really are always kind. So she's like my saint. And she's like, I'm always kind to them. And they were being so mean and said terrible things to her and just, threw down. And I said, well, Mom wasn't home. And so that was kind of throwing the night off a little bit already. Dinner got really late. We couldn't find the stuffed animal that they want, So I'm like, rolling through all of these reasons. I'm like, so there was just really a lot of dysregulation. And so I think they were just really dysregulated. And she goes, well, aren't you growing as a human?
She said that to you?
She said that to me. And I just laughed. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? And she's like, seriously, like, I was dysregulated a lot too, but I don't think you ever called it dysregulation. Like, you just got onto me and told me to stop, And
wow.
And I'm like, you're right. Like, I did. Like, that's how I parented you. And I said, I'm so sorry. And she's like, no, like, I mean that as a compliment. Like, you are growing as a human. And like, that's so encouraging to me that I can see, like, you keep trying to be better for me. And she's like, you being better for them is you being better for me. And she's like, so that's good to see. Like, it's encouraging. Like, you and Mom are always trying to improve on yourselves and be better for us and be different. And I appreciate it,
It's insightful of her.
It was very insightful.
I think I always feel bad for the oldest because you make all the mistakes, but then
Yes.
you think about it, they actually get the benefit of seeing the change,
Yes.
though, which the youngest
Yes.
just kind of knows chill Mom and Dad,
Yes.
who
Yes.
are way more evolved. Well, good for her for seeing that.
It was super encouraging and helpful.
So, okay, let's talk for a minute about an organization. So if you
Yes.
think about this, it makes me sad sometimes to realize, like, at some point in my life, I just realized nothing lasts forever.
Right.
Literally, I've learned to be very thankful for the seasons I'm in, because it's like even a really great friendship, like, there is nothing that will last forever.
Yeah.
The nature of life is change. Organizations change. Like, Grace Church today is not the Grace Church of 5 years ago. What would you say to someone who wrestles with that organizationally? Like, I came into this church, this business, this company, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
And it was one way, and now it's evolving, and I don't like that. And how do you process that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great question, because I think what you said is true. Like, everything is changing all the time, right? And so even companies that exist, the only companies that exist for a long time are the ones that are willing to evolve.
Agree.
Right? Like,
Actually, true, yeah.
So it's almost like if we're unwilling to evolve, that is like
the kiss of death.
Kiss of death, the last nail in the coffin. Like, that is how you lose what you have. And I think there's this perception we have, like, we want to freeze things in moments in time, and we want them to stay just like that. And then we get sad that they're not that any longer. But I think, the reality is it's not going to stay the same. So it's kind of like we can evolve and change with it, or we can leave it. And I think that is what some people do, is they're like, well, this isn't what it used to be, so I can't appreciate it for what it is. I'm going to go find somewhere else. The reality is they've lost it either way. And so it's almost like you want to either hold on to what's still good about it. And I think even like Grace Church, there are core elements of Grace Church that have never changed. Like, our mission statement is helping people take their next step toward Christ. That will be the case for forever. 2019 or 2018, somewhere around there, like, we put our house rules out and we're like, this defines our culture. And I think that is who we are. But how it is expressed looks different all the time. And so I think it's helpful if you, like, I think organizationally it's been helpful for us to say, this is our mission, which isn't changing. These are our house rules and our culture, which isn't changing. How you experience those, how those are expressed may change over time. But I think it's let us put some anchors down to take people back to. When somebody says, this doesn't feel the same, I can say, well, talk to me about that. What does that look like? And sometimes it ends with people saying, you're right. I want it to grow. I want us to reach more people. I just don't want it to get bigger. I'm like, those two things can't exist. Like, we can't reach more people and stay the exact same size. Like, it's not possible.
Yeah.
And if we stop reaching people, then
what's the point?
What are we doing?
Right. Right. We're just a little country club.
Yes. With a limited number of spots, and turn them over as we can. So. Yeah, so it is interesting, because I think it is a great paradox of, like, what we want is these things to be the same for forever. And yet we know they're not. Like, your relationships, your marriage, your kids, everything is continually evolving. And I think, my degree's in leadership development, and one of the classes I had to take was called Change, Creation, and Management. And it was fascinating, because it's like, change is going to come. So how do you manage that change? And then how do you create the right type of change? And, they started the class by saying change is the only constant. And it's like, okay, so if you can get in your mind, like everything is going to change and it's always going to be changing, then how can you learn to embrace change and then help shape it? And I think that's, for me, like that whole 5-year principle is part of that. Is it's like, I want to be, like if I'm intentional on the outputs, the version of me in 5 years is going to be different. And I'm going to have some say in the outcomes. Like there's things that I'm going to have no say in, right?
Right.
But if I'm intentional with the inputs, then I can have some more control over the outcomes, because 5 years from now, I'm going to be a different person regardless. Whether I want to change, whether I don't want to, like, Rick at 50 is going to be different than Rick at 45, and if I'm not intentional with the inputs, I have very little control over that version of me. But if I'm intentional with the inputs, then I'm shaping that person of me. I'm helping to, control who that person is. And hopefully it's a better version. So
you made that comment about, you took the class on how to, like what are the right changes to make, even from an organizational standpoint. What's the nugget, or like in a nutshell, how do you know what's the right change for a person? I think we have scripture and things like that to guide us. What would you say organizationally?
I mean, I think it largely depends on the organization. I mean, if you're talking about a business, like the number one goal is profit and sustainability. And so it's like we're making decisions around what changes are going to drive profit and drive sustainability for the organization. I think for the church, it's more, what is our mission? Well, we're helping people take their next step toward Christ. So what changes do we need to make that would help us to be most effective at accomplishing that mission? And that looks different over time. Like ministry in the 90s looks different than ministries now. Gen Z would laugh at some of the stuff and just never show up if we did ministry like it was 1993. I mean, some of it they would love, so they're like, bring it all back. But I think it's, how do we become effective? And so for me, and this may be my Enneagram 3, is it's like, I don't ever want to embrace change for the sake of change. I want to embrace change for the change of being effective, for the sake of moving this thing forward faster if we can, reaching more people, helping more people, And so, even our counseling center, like we are sitting, here right now, and they're doing this construction in the background, they're doing all this stuff. But like, we started with this counseling center in 2019 that was like, we're gonna meet in the evenings, and we're gonna use some offices, and we're gonna provide some counseling. And so we had 2 or 3 people doing it, and then we were like, oh, we're gonna renovate this warehouse space and turn it into 5 offices, And so we've gone to these different evolutions, and now we're gonna open this new counseling center. But it's not just changed. The space has not just changed, like the entire organization has had to change. Like we've had to develop policies and processes and do all of these things to equip therapists and make sure that we're able to control what's happening in the room in some sense, and control the processes and all of these pieces. Why? Well, because we want to be able to reach more people in Central Florida. We know there's this mental health crisis. So we have to change organizationally to meet that demand. And a counseling center with 25 rooms and 100 therapists is going to look very different than 2 people counseling in my office, and me not knowing they're there and barging in and people crying, oh, hey, sorry guys, So
I literally just did that to Clint.
It's happened. So like, sorry. So
it's funny. It's like the right type of change. I think we just tend to hold on to the negative too. It's like, you could sit in a church and be like, I miss the days when we, the good old days when it was this many people, but then you wouldn't have access to therapy. You wouldn't have, you know what I mean? Like it's so easy to not celebrate. And a theme I keep hearing coming back is just gratitude, grace, celebrating where you actually are. And it's so much about a perspective shift, What chapter would you say you're in now of your life?
So I feel like I am most hopeful right now than I think I've ever been. I really think. I think, my kids are getting now so that we are ranging 8 to 16. So we're kind of through toddler phases and through all of that. I feel like the church is in a very healthy place. I feel like we're on, the precipice of opening the counseling center. So I just feel like there's so many positive things right now. And all of them, there's negative things attached with that, right? Like as things are growing and changing, and there's hard things that you're dealing with and challenges that you're facing. But right now, I just feel like we're in this sweet spot of, one, I think personally I'm growing, I'm becoming healthier. Christy and I are engaging in new ways, and so I feel like this December we'll be married 24 years, so we're coming up on like the quarter century mark of being married for 25 years, which is crazy. And so, but for me, I feel like we're beginning to reap benefit from kind of some of this long, hard, like I've been working in a church since I was 18. And so I'm, be 46 next year. So I feel like there's just becoming, like, I feel like we're getting to a season of fruitfulness and being able
Abundance,
to reap and enjoy some of those things. Not that there's still not a ton of work to do, but so it just feels like a sweet spot right now. So
I love that.
Yeah.
I'm not quite there, but I think that maybe in some aspects of my, I would definitely say professionally I'm not there, but I will say that in my marriage, I think it's never been sweeter. And I think it's the evolution of all the hard work, of all the time of becoming a better person, having grace for the failures and the mistakes.
Yes.
And it is neat to get to a place where you can say, I am reaping some reward from that.
Right.
Like and sometimes you have to have the perspective of backing up, like, to just remember what you were like in your 20s. You know what I mean? See, I saw, I was telling you about that book, Hidden Potential, but he does little graphs in it. There's one where it shows this little like downward slope, and it's like, this is what you see, this is where you are. And then it zoomed out and you had gone up this huge mountain, and all you saw was that last little, like, it's like, they call it mental time travel in therapy, where you actually go back, and if the young you could see Rick now, they'd be like, wow, like, you're doing so much, but when you're right in it, sometimes you don't see it. So, and
I think, Jeanne, like, even that concept of like people longing for things in the past, like, oh, I wish the organization hadn't changed. But the reality is if you at this state of yourself went back to that organization, you wouldn't experience it in the same way. Like there would be things about it that you didn't even see then. They're like, oh, why did they do that? So it's almost like there's this song, I'm terrible with song lyrics, but there's a song, I graduated in 1997. There's a song, and it's a speech to the class of 1999. It's called Wear Sunscreen. You can go search it up. But in it, it's literally just like this guy giving like a speech to, like, he says wear sunscreen, and then he goes through all these other things. But one of the things he says in it is he's talking about nostalgia. And he says, nostalgia has a way of taking the trash out of the garbage compactor, dusting off the ugly parts, painting over them, and recycling for more than it's worth. And I'm like, there's something true to that, of like, we remember fondly, and we kind of brush over the bad parts and kind of forget those things. And like, oh, that's what I long for. But I think sometimes we're not even actually longing for a real version of something. Like, we're longing for the way we remember it.
Fantasy version of it.
Yes.
I used to really have this with Clint. I'm just remembering it now because I am past this, but like, there was this time when I just could not get past it. The romantic, like, falling in love part of it was done. And I was like, don't you just like, do you wrestle with that, Clint? Like, don't you long for the days when we like could not wait to see each other on a date? Like, we were just so excited. And I kept just wrestling with it. And one day Clint said to me, like, I don't want to go back and redo. I want to build a future with you. Like, I don't want to keep rehashing the past. And I just never forgot it because I was like, it's just a different way of thinking. Like, but even then, those were dusted off. I don't remember all the sobbing and the fighting. Those, this is the one. I mean, like, that was
all the torture.
Horrible. So,
and I don't know. I had a friend tell me that sometimes we long for like these old fires. He's like, but if you go back to the old fires, you find that they're only embers, and like, there's no way to rekindle that thing. Like, that was done, and that was gone, and that was in the past. And it's like, it's like, he's like, there's relationships that were fires and flames at one point in time, and then they're embers now, and that's okay. Like, but I think there's a sense of maybe even grieving some of those things. And I think that's part of the integration of your story, like grieving that person, grieving that happened, and then being able to, grow from that. And so
I like that you say integration of your story, that bringing it kind of full circle. It's the same with the girl who can't accept the old version of her, mourning that sin, but also integrating it and loving her. Same with organizations that change, marriages, relationships. The joy is in the journey, not just the next achievement. But thank you so much, Pastor Rick. I am glad to know who you are becoming. It's really beautiful.
Grace After Hours is a production of Grace Church in Orlando, Florida. Grace's mission is helping people take their next step toward Christ. Learn more at discovergrace.com. If you enjoy this podcast, share it with someone you know and subscribe so you never miss an episode.